All right, so in the notes for today for 20.2c, we're going to be looking at histograms. You can see a picture of a histogram right here. Histograms are sometimes referred to as bar graphs, and each bar represents the frequency of the data that falls within that range. A histogram is defined as being a graph that displays the frequency of data in intervals. And so here there's an example that's done out for you. So in this first example, it says the data below are the number of hours per week a group of students spent watching TV. And so you can see that the numbers down here aren't given as individual numbers, they're given as intervals. And so you may find it helpful to write on your paper that for 0 to 5 hours, the bar goes up to 6. And so there are 6 total students that spend that much time watching TV. The second bar for 6 to 11 hours goes up to 5. And so that one has 5. From 12 to 17 hours, there are 3 students that reported spending that much time watching TV. And then for 18 through 23 hours per week, there was 1 student that reported that. 6 plus 5 plus 3 plus 1 gives you 15. And so later, it's going to be helpful for us to think about what the total amount of data values in the list are. So when we're creating a histogram on our own, we're going to be given a list of numbers like you see in the examples on the next side of the page, but we're going to have to be able to determine 2 things. We're going to have to be able to figure out the number of intervals that we're supposed to have, so that's how many bars there will be on the graph, and we're also going to need to figure out the interval length, or how long each of those intervals will be. So it's not just arbitrarily decided. To determine the number of intervals that you're going to do, so the number of bars on your graph, you're going to count up the number of the data values. So in the previous example, we'd be using 15 as our answer, and then you're going to take the square root of that number. It says here to round to the nearest whole number. To figure out the length of each interval, so how many values should fall within that range, we're going to take the range. Remember, the range is the biggest number, take away the smallest number, so that's how you get the number that goes on the top. And then we're going to divide it by the number of intervals. So the answer that you got on the previous question is the number that goes in the denominator. So you'll divide those, and then you'll round that to the nearest whole number. So here in our first example, we're going to go through and we're going to create a histogram for the data that are in the list. So you want to start out by counting how many numbers there are. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And so we're going to start by figuring out how many intervals there should be and how long each interval should be. So remember, to figure out the number of intervals, you're going to take the number of values in the list of data, and so we just counted these ones up and there was 13, and then you're going to take the square root of that number. And so when you type the square root of 13 into your calculator, you get a decimal out as your answer, but when you round it to the nearest whole number, you get 4. So that means that when I'm done, there's going to be about 4 bars on this graph. To figure out the interval length, I need to look at my list of numbers. The first thing I need to figure out is the range. So I'm going to find the highest number, which in this list is 105, and then I'm going to find the lowest number in the list, which for this list is 80. And so to figure out the interval length, I'm going to do 105, take away 80 in the top, and then I'm going to divide that by the answer that I got for the interval length on the previous question. So for this one, that'll work out to 25 divided by 4, which is approximately 6. Now that you know approximately how many intervals you're going to have and the length that each one will be, we need to set up the numbering on our graph. And so for my finishing times, my lowest number is 80, and then I'm going to have each interval be 6 units long. When you count the intervals to make sure they're going to be 6 units long, don't forget you include the 80. So 80, 81, 82, 83, 84, and 85. My first range right here is going to be for all of the data values that go from 80 to 85. Then you skip to 86, and you're going to make that one be 6 units long as well, and then you'll continue. Notice that when I get to the end right here, and I have my 4 intervals, and I've counted by 6 on each one, I'm at 103, but looking back up at the problem, I had a data value at 105, so that means that I'm actually going to need to add a 5th interval to this graph, and I'll put the data here. Alright, now that I have my intervals set up, I'm going to go through my list of numbers, and I'm going to count how many numbers fall within this range, and that's how high I'll draw this bar. How many numbers fall within this range, and that's how high I'll draw this bar. You don't know how many numbers you're going to need to put here on this vertical axis for the frequency until you start counting up the numbers. But for this list of numbers, the biggest number of values that fall within each of these intervals is 4, so I only need this axis to go up to 4. So for my data from 80 to 85, when you look in the list, 80 to 85, so there's 1, 2, sometimes you cross them out as you go, that's helpful. 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's 4 numbers that fall within that range. And then from 86 to 91, if you look in the list, there are 1, 2, 3 numbers that fall within that range. From 92 to 97, there are 2 numbers that fall within that range. From 98 to 103, there are 1, 2, 3 numbers that fall within that range. And then lastly, there was one number, 105, that fell within the 104 to 109 range. Once you're all done graphing, it can be helpful to go back and count to make sure that you have your total. Remember, for this one there were 13 numbers in the list of data, and so 4, 3, 2, 3, and 1, that gives you your total of 13. And so you know that you have all of the numbers represented in the histogram. Alright, so in this next example, we're doing the same thing. This one's about scores on a test, and so we're going to start off by figuring out the number of intervals and the interval length that we're going to be using for this histogram. And so remember, to figure out the number of intervals, you have to count how many numbers are in the list of data, and for this one there are 17 numbers in the list. And so to figure out how many intervals you're going to need, you're going to take that number and take the square root of it. So when you take the square root of 17, it's going to give you a decimal, and then the nearest number that it rounds to is the number 4. So as we saw in the last problem, we might not need exactly 4. We might end up needing a 5th bar. It just depends on how much you needed to round each one of the numbers. But you always round this to the nearest whole number. So there will be approximately 4 intervals when we're done. And then with this one, for the interval length, I need to find the largest number in my list and the smallest number in my list, and then I'm going to find the range, and then I'll divide the range by the number 4. So 83 minus 66 divided by 4 is going to give me 17 divided by 4, which again, when I round that to the nearest whole number, that's approximately 4. So I'm going to have about 4 intervals. Each one of them will be 4 units long. So once I have my interval length and then my number of intervals set up, I can go ahead and I can set up my x-axis. And so I'll start with my least data value. So for this one, my least data value was 66, and I'm going to have the interval be 4 longs. And so this first one will be for all the scores that were from 66 to 69. And then remember, you jump to 70, 74, 75, 76, 77, 78, 79, 80, 81. And so those are my 4 intervals that I had approximated I would need. But notice that when I'm done, the biggest number in my interval length, it's still not big enough for me to graph this data value, so I'm going to need to do one more. And so that last one would be from 82 to 85. Now that I have those done, I'm ready to graph the height of each one of the bars for my graph on my histogram, and I do that by looking back up at the list of numbers and counting how many of the values fall within each range. You don't know how high you're going to need the bars to be until you count them. For this graph, my highest bar is going to need to go up to 8. Alright, and so once that's ready to go, I can count my intervals. So from 66 to 69, in the list of data up above, there are 3 numbers that fall within that range. And then next up, from 70 to 73, up in the list above, there are 2 data values that fall within that range. From 70 to 74, there's a lot on this one, there are 8 data values that fall within that range. And then from 78 to 81, there are 2. And lastly, from 82 to 85, there are 2. Remember, when you're all done, it can be helpful to go back and either above the bar, sometimes people draw it sitting up here, or inside the bar is fine too. This is 3, this is 2, this was 8, this was 2, and this was 2. We remember from when we found the intervals, there were 17 values in the list, and so we can go back and add these up to make sure that there are 17, and so that checks out, and so that's good because it means that we didn't miss any of the numbers. On the second page of notes, you'll see some screenshots here that might look familiar. So your graphing calculator that you're used to using when you're in class, those calculators have the capability of graphing histograms, and you can create histograms. So these screenshots help you follow through with the steps that you would need in order to do that. On your assignment tonight, just ignore the directions that say to use a calculator too. We're not going to cover this because not everybody has access to one of these calculators right now. And so anytime on your homework where you see it says use a calculator too, you're just going to go through and do it by hand. We're going to skip doing examples A and B on this side of the notes because everything that we needed was on the front side. And so that's it.